As the boarding gate buzzed with activity, families, business travelers, and vacationers alike hurried toward their respective seats. Among them, Nathan Caldwell, his wife Elena, and their 5-year-old son Leo stepped onto the aircraft. Eager to settle into their long-awaited first-class seats, Nathan, dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit, exuded quiet confidence. He carried a sleek leather briefcase, the polished shine of his shoes reflecting the soft cabin lights. Elena, poised and radiant in an elegant ivory dress, held Leo's small hand as he skipped beside her. His face lit up with excitement. The little boy clutched a toy airplane in his free hand, his giggles echoing softly as he marveled at the spacious, luxurious interior of the first-class cabin. Nathan guided his family to their seats, glancing at the numbers with a faint smile. "Here we are," he murmured, helping Elena settle in before carefully placing their carry-ons in the overhead compartment. Nearby passengers gave polite nods, some offering warm smiles as they observed the affectionate young family. Elena helped Leo into his seat, fastening his seatbelt while handing him a small juice box. It was supposed to be a relaxing, much-needed trip for the Caldwells, a moment to step away from their demanding lives, unwind, and simply enjoy each other's company. However, not everyone in the cabin welcomed them so warmly. Across the aisle, a flight attendant named Victoria Shaw observed the family with a sharp, assessing gaze, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line as she adjusted her uniform and strode briskly toward them, her forced smile failing to conceal the judgment behind her eyes. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice carrying an air of authority as she stopped beside Nathan's seat. "I'll need to see your boarding passes. Please." Nathan looked up, momentarily caught off guard. He had flown countless times, and never once had a flight attendant singled him out like this. He exchanged a glance with Elena, whose brow furrowed with concern, before reaching into his jacket pocket. "Of course," he said evenly, handing over the crisp, printed passes without hesitation. Victoria took them with an almost exaggerated scrutiny, flipping them over as if expecting to uncover some mistake. Her eyebrows knitted together as she examined the details. "First class?" she murmured, almost as though the words were foreign to her. Nathan's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but his expression remained composed. "Yes, these are our seats," he confirmed, his voice calm yet firm. Elena, sensing the tension, placed a protective hand on Leo's shoulder. The little boy, blissfully unaware of the exchange, happily played with his toy airplane, making quiet whooshing sounds as he imagined it soaring through the sky. Victoria hesitated, the discomfort in her posture evident. "I need to verify something with the front desk," she said curtly, handing the passes back without another word. Before Nathan could respond, she turned on her heel and walked away, her steps brisk and tense. Elena let out a quiet breath, her fingers gripping the armrest. "That was strange," she murmured under her breath. Nathan placed a reassuring hand over hers. "It's probably just a routine check," he said, though the slight tightening of his mouth suggested otherwise. He had felt the weight of Victoria's scrutiny, felt the judgment in her tone. It wasn't the first time he had encountered something like this, and a sinking feeling told him it wouldn't be the last. Meanwhile, in the galley, Victoria was already on the phone with a ground staff member. "I have a situation here," she muttered, glancing over her shoulder toward the first-class cabin. "There's a family in seats 3A and 3B, and I'm not sure their tickets are valid. Can you confirm their booking?" There was a pause on the other end before the ground staffer responded. Their voice puzzled. "The Caldwell family? Their tickets were purchased weeks ago. Fully confirmed. First-class fare. Is there an issue?" Victoria's grip on the phone tightened, her expression flickering between frustration and embarrassment. No issue," she muttered before abruptly ending the call. She stood there for a moment, fists clenched at her sides, before forcing herself to take a deep breath and school her features into neutrality. When she returned to the cabin, her demeanor had shifted, but the tension in her expression lingered. "Thank you for your patience," she said stiffly, handing Nathan back his boarding passes with a forced politeness. Nathan accepted them with a nod. "Thank you," he replied simply, his composure unwavering. Elena exhaled softly, her shoulders finally relaxing as Victoria turned and walked away. But something in Nathan's gaze remained guarded. As the plane continued boarding, Other passengers stole glances in their direction, a few appearing to sense the unease that had briefly settled over the cabin. Nathan sat back in his seat, one hand resting lightly on Leo's, his mind replaying the interaction. Unbeknownst to Victoria, the Caldwell family wasn't just any wealthy couple flying first class. Nathan wasn't merely a successful businessman, he was the CEO of the very airline they were flying on. He had built this company from the ground up, ensuring that every passenger, regardless of background, was treated with fairness and respect. And yet, here he was, experiencing firsthand the very discrimination he had fought to eliminate. For now, he let it go, but deep inside, a slow-burning fire had been ignited, a quiet determination settling into his bones. This was bigger than just a single moment of bias, it was a reflection of something systemic. And if there was one thing Nathan Caldwell believed in, it was holding people accountable. Little did Victoria know, her actions had set something much larger in motion, something that would change everything. Veronica Summers thought she had put the matter to rest. She had returned the boarding passes to Nathan Caldwell with a forced smile, hoping to move past the uncomfortable exchange. But something about him unsettled her. His calmness, his unwavering gaze, it didn't sit right with her. Most passengers, when questioned, would have shown frustration, indignation, or even anger. But Nathan? He had remained composed, unreadable, almost as if he were evaluating her rather than the other way around. Back in the galley, she reached for a glass of water, but her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was guilt, though she wasn't ready to admit that to herself. Maybe it was the way the other passengers had begun to take notice. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the creeping feeling that she had made a mistake. One that was about to come crashing down on her. And then, the phone rang. Flight deck to cabin crew. The voice crackled over the intercom. Veronica stiffened. Summers, report to the front immediately. Her breath hitched. She had been a flight attendant for years. Long enough to know that this was unusual. Something was happening, something big. The other attendants cast glances her way, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. Taking a steadying breath, she straightened her uniform and walked briskly toward the front of the aircraft, her heartbeat quickening with every step. As she entered the flight deck, the captain turned to her, his face unusually grim. "We just received a direct call from the airline's executive office," he said slowly, as if measuring every word. "It's about a passenger in first class. A Mr. Nathan Caldwell." Veronica's stomach twisted. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "Yes, Captain. I had a minor issue verifying his boarding pass earlier. But it's been resolved. Do you have any idea who that man is?" The captain cut her off. His voice edged with something Veronica couldn't quite place. Disbelief? Fear? Veronica hesitated, her pulse pounding. "No, sir," she admitted, though the unease in her chest was growing. The captain exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple as if she had just said something unfathomably stupid. "Nathan Caldwell isn't just some first-class passenger," he said, lowering his voice. "He owns the airline." The words hit Veronica like a punch to the gut. The blood drained from her face. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her mind scrambling to process what she had just heard. That can't be right." "Oh, it's right," the captain confirmed. "Not only is he a primary shareholder, but he's also the CEO. And you, Veronica, just questioned his legitimacy to sit in his own airline's first-class cabin." The room tilted. Veronica gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "We've already received an official inquiry from the board," the captain continued, his tone sharp. "They want a full report on what transpired between you and Mr. Caldwell. This is beyond a simple misunderstanding. This is an internal crisis." Veronica swallowed hard, but her throat felt dry, like sandpaper scraping against itself. She forced herself to speak, though her voice barely carried. "Sir, I didn't know," she stammered. "I was just following standard procedure." "Standard procedure?" the captain repeated, his eyes narrowing. "Would you have questioned him if he looked different?" Veronica flinched as if struck. She didn't answer, because she knew the truth. A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Veronica's mind raced for an escape, a justification, a way to undo the damage she had caused. But there was nothing, no excuse, no reasoning that would make what she had done acceptable. Nathan Caldwell is a man with power, the captain said, his voice softer now but no less serious. He could ruin your career with a single call. And by the looks of it, he might already have. Panic clawed at her chest. No, this wasn't how this was supposed to happen. She had always been careful, always followed protocol, always stayed on the right side of authority. But now, the authority wasn't on her side. It was Nathan Caldwell, a man who, at this very moment, was calmly seated in first class, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just shaken the foundation of everything Veronica had built. And then, as if fate itself wanted to twist the knife deeper, the intercom crackled again. Cabin crew, please prepare for an unexpected communication. We are receiving direct instructions from headquarters. Veronica barely registered the words before the captain turned to her once more. You better pray he's feeling merciful, he said, his voice quiet but cold. Because if he isn't, your career ends the moment we land. The finality in his voice was devastating. As Veronica stumbled back toward the galley, her hands shook so violently she could barely grip the counter. The other attendants exchanged wary glances, sensing that something was terribly wrong. She felt their stares, felt the weight of her impending reckoning, but all she could focus on was Nathan Caldwell. Back in first class, Nathan sat with perfect composure, sipping a glass of water as if the events of the last half hour were of no concern to him. His young son, Leo, was playing with his toy airplane, unaware of the storm raging around them. Elena sat beside them, her presence serene but unreadable, her fingers idly tracing patterns on her napkin. Nathan's phone vibrated on the armrest. He glanced at it, reading the message from his executive team with an almost amused expression. She knows now. He took another sip of water, then leaned back in his seat, his gaze flickering toward the galley where Veronica had disappeared. She thought this was over. But for Nathan Caldwell, this was only the beginning. And when the plane landed, she would come to understand exactly what that meant. The moment Nathan Caldwell and his family were asked to leave first class, an uneasy silence fell over the cabin. Passengers exchanged confused glances, their curiosity piqued by the flight attendant's firm stance. Most were unsure what had just transpired, but the sheer tension in the air was undeniable. Celeste Caldwell gathered Leo in her arms, her jaw clenched as she followed her husband down the aisle. Nathan's face remained impassive, but his grip on the handle of his briefcase tightened ever so slightly, a small but telling sign that he was holding something back. At first, the whispers were hushed. A middle-aged woman in a business suit leaned toward her seatmate, murmuring, "Did you see that? They had first-class tickets, didn't they?" "I think so," the man beside her replied, frowning. That didn't seem right. But as the Caldwell family reached the main cabin, whispers turned into audible murmurs, and murmurs became scattered protests. They were sitting there quietly. Someone said from row 3A, "That kid is 5. What could they have possibly done wrong?" Another voice chimed in. Veronica Summers, still standing stiffly in the first-class section, felt the weight of the passengers' stares. Her stomach twisted uncomfortably. She had expected them to ignore it, to brush the incident aside like so many other in-flight inconveniences. But something about this was different. And then, a phone camera flashed. The woman from 3A had her phone raised, recording the aftermath of the incident. "This is wrong," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone around her to hear. That was a family with confirmed seats in first class. They weren't being disruptive. So what's the real reason they were asked to leave? Veronica's breath caught. This was not good. Passengers around the woman started pulling out their phones as well. A man in the row behind her had already started typing on his screen, his fingers moving quickly. Within minutes, the flight had become a real-time story unfolding on social media. A black family just got removed from first class for no reason. Flight attendant refuses to explain. Who else has dealt with this kind of discrimination on a plane? The tweet, accompanied by a blurry video of Nathan's retreating figure and Celeste's expression of controlled anger, was posted, and it exploded. By the time the plane was cruising at altitude, the story had already started gaining traction. Comments flooded in. "I've been there. They act like you don't belong the moment you step into first class. This is disgusting. Which airline? We're boycotting. He's handling this so calmly. I wouldn't have. I'd be raising hell." Nathan sat in the cramped middle row. his arms resting on the armrests as Celeste comforted Leo, who was pouting about losing his window seat. He could hear the murmurs growing louder around him, but he remained composed. The man in the seat next to him, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. "I don't mean to pry. But I saw what happened. That wasn't right." Nathan turned to him, his expression unreadable. The man continued, emboldened. "Do you want me to email customer service on your behalf? I mean, I know it won't fix it. But maybe if enough of us say something, they'll listen." Celeste looked up, her eyes glistening with something that looked like gratitude. "That's very kind of you," she said, voice steady despite the emotion simmering beneath it. More passengers chimed in. "They need to be held accountable for this." A younger woman added, "I mean, if it were any of us, would they have done the same thing?" The situation had transformed from a quiet injustice to a full-blown protest among the passengers. The atmosphere in the cabin was shifting. People weren't just observing anymore, they were getting involved. Meanwhile, on the ground, the airline's social media team was in full crisis mode. "We have a situation," a junior analyst muttered, eyes darting across multiple screens displaying real-time engagement metrics. The hashtag #FlyFair was now trending, and angry comments flooded the airline's latest posts. The PR director, standing behind him, paled as she read a particular tweet. Her voice was tight as she turned to the team. "Get me the details of the flight. Now." Back in the air, Veronica tried to maintain her composure. But the pressure was mounting. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, the judgment in their eyes. A younger flight attendant, Grace, approached her cautiously. "Veronica, maybe we should fix this," Grace whispered, glancing toward the main cabin, where the energy was growing more hostile by the second. Veronica's jaw tightened. "It's already done," she snapped, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Grace hesitated, then murmured, "Maybe, but I think you picked the wrong person to do this to." Veronica's heart pounded. She could feel it, the shift in power. Nathan Caldwell hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't caused a scene. He had simply existed in the space where he rightfully belonged. And now, because of her actions, the world was watching, and it was demanding answers. By the time the plane began its descent, passengers were already discussing whether they should wait at the gate to file official complaints. Nathan, still silent, checked his phone. His inbox was flooded with messages. One, from his legal team, was particularly interesting. "We're monitoring the situation. Expect a formal response from the airline within hours." Nathan smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. Veronica, sitting in the galley, felt her hands tremble slightly. She had expected compliance. What she got was a reckoning. And it was far from over. Nathan Caldwell sat in the cramped middle seat of the economy cabin, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. The once joyous excitement of the trip had been soured by a single moment, a moment where a stranger, with nothing but misplaced authority, had decided that he and his family did not belong. Celeste sat beside him, her posture tense, her fingers gripping the armrest tightly. In her lap, little Leo clutched his toy airplane, his big eyes flickering with confusion. He didn't understand why they had to move. He didn't understand why they had gone from plush, spacious seats to this crowded, uncomfortable space. Nathan knew that someday, he would have to explain this to his son. But not today. Today, he focused on what was happening around him. And it was happening. Passengers murmured, their voices rising just above the steady hum of the aircraft. "That was wrong," one man muttered, shaking his head. "They didn't do anything. Why were they kicked out of first class?" A woman across the aisle frowned, her phone still raised after recording the scene. "I don't know, but I've been watching airlines do stuff like this for years. This time, people are going to see it." She wasn't wrong. On the ground, thousands of people had already seen the video. The internet had taken hold of the injustice and was running with it, turning a private humiliation into a global conversation. The tweet that started it all now had over 30,000 retweets. A black family was removed from first class despite having confirmed tickets. The flight attendant refused to explain. The father stayed calm. "But I'm fuming. Who else is tired of this happening?" The replies came in a flood. "This isn't just a one-time mistake. It's a pattern, and it needs to stop. That man handled this with more grace than I ever could." Somebody better fix this before the airline loses more than just a lawsuit. This was discrimination. Period. And then, a new development. Someone had identified the flight attendant, Veronica Summers. Within minutes, her name was trending. People were demanding accountability. And it wasn't just strangers on the internet, it was journalists, activists, and even celebrities who were amplifying the call for justice. Back in the air, Veronica felt the shift. It was in the way the passengers looked at her now, no longer with passive politeness, but with cold, unwavering disapproval. She knew what they were thinking. She had made a very public mistake. A younger flight attendant, Grace, approached her hesitantly. "Veronica," she whispered, her voice urgent, "this is going viral. The airline's PR team just contacted the captain. They're investigating already." Veronica's stomach twisted. She turned her back to the passengers, trying to breathe. This was supposed to be routine, a quiet assertion of control. A simple move to reinforce an unspoken rule. She hadn't expected pushback. She hadn't expected people to care. But they did. And now, she was losing control of the narrative. Nathan, meanwhile, remained composed. He sat tall, unwavering, unbothered. But Celeste could see it, the flicker of fire behind his eyes. He wasn't letting this go. And neither was the public. Back on the ground, the airline's headquarters was in full-blown crisis mode. Phones rang non-stop, emails flooded in, customers were threatening to cancel their flights, vowing to boycott until action was taken. The CEO, Robert Langston, stood at the head of a long, glass conference table, his face tight with frustration. "Tell me you have an explanation," he demanded, his voice cold. A woman from the HR department hesitated. "Sir, the reports indicate that the Caldwell family's tickets were completely valid. They were removed with no justified cause." Langston exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "And the flight attendant responsible?" The HR representative swallowed. "Her name is Veronica Summers. She claims she was following protocol. But there is no protocol that justifies this." Langston's fingers drummed against the table, his mind calculating. The shareholder meetings, the stock value, the media pressure. This wasn't just an embarrassment, it was a financial threat. "Find out exactly what happened," he ordered, "and draft an apology." Now, back in the sky, Veronica was called to the cockpit. She walked stiffly, her nerves raw. As she stepped inside, the captain, a stern man in his 50s, turned to her. "Summers, I just got off a call with corporate. They are not happy. Do you have any idea what you've started?" She swallowed. "Sir, you crossed a line," he cut in, his tone sharp. "I don't care what you thought you were doing. Our job is to treat every passenger with respect. And you failed." Her stomach dropped. The flight was still in progress. But she knew what was waiting for her when they landed. Meanwhile, Nathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. His lawyer. "Give me details," Nathan said quietly. "We're monitoring everything," his lawyer replied. "The airline is scrambling. They're in damage control mode. That means you have leverage." Nathan's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Leverage. The same thing that had made him a successful entrepreneur was now turning the tides in this situation. He knew the game. And now, he was playing to win. As the plane began its descent, the tension reached its peak. Passengers braced themselves, not just for landing, but for what would happen next. Would the airline apologize? Would Veronica face consequences? Or would this be yet another story of injustice that faded away? As the plane touched down, Veronica's nerves frayed. She could feel it, the end of something. And she was right. The moment the aircraft doors opened, she was met by airport security. "Veronica Summers," one of the officers said, his expression unreadable. She froze. "Yes? You need to come with us." Passengers watched as she was led away. Back inside the airport, Nathan and Celeste stood tall, their son's small hand nestled between them. Journalists were already there, microphones ready, cameras rolling. Nathan glanced down at Leo, then back at Celeste. "You ready?" she asked softly. His eyes burned with quiet resolve. More than ever, he stepped forward, facing the crowd, facing the moment. This wasn't just about his family. This was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And he wasn't going to let it go. Not now, not ever. If you believe in fairness, if you believe in standing up for what's right, like this video. Comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that expose the truth. Because this is far from over. This is just the beginning. The room was cold, not physically, but in its atmosphere, the sterile, impersonal kind of cold that made Veronica's skin prickle as she sat. Fingers tightly clasped, across from the three-member airline review panel. Her heart pounded, each beat thudding against her ribs like a drum counting down to something irreversible. She had been here before, conference rooms, performance reviews, meetings with supervisors, but this time was different. This wasn't about her job performance or whether she had met her monthly evaluation goals. This was about her character. The gray-suited man in the center cleared his throat, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. His expression was unreadable, but the tightness around his mouth hinted at disapproval. "Miss Summers," he began, flipping open a file, "we've reviewed the footage, the passenger complaints, and the official reports from your flight crew members. Would you like to explain your actions before we proceed?" Veronica swallowed hard. She had known this was coming. She had spent the last 12 hours replaying the scene over and over in her head. Every word she had spoken, every glance she had thrown at Nathan Caldwell and his family, every assumption she had made. She had convinced herself that she was simply doing her job, following protocol, but deep down, she knew the truth. It hadn't been about the tickets. It had been about them. And now, she was paying the price. I thought there was a mistake," she said, her voice weaker than she intended. "I didn't mean for things to escalate the way they did. I was just..." "A mistake?" The woman on the left, a sharp-eyed senior HR manager, raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Miss Summers, their tickets were confirmed. You knew that the moment you called ground staff. They assured you the family belonged in first class. And yet, you proceeded to remove them." Veronica's chest tightened. The man in the middle cut her off. "You didn't believe they belonged there, did you?" The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Veronica's mouth went dry. She wanted to argue. She wanted to insist that it wasn't about race, about status, about class, but she had no defense. Because it was about those things. And for the first time, she saw it. She had acted on an instinct, a bias she hadn't even realized had rooted itself in her thinking. She had looked at Nathan Caldwell and his family and, without hesitation, doubted them. She thought about the look in Celeste's eyes as she held her son. The painful dignity in Nathan's face as he led them out of first class without raising his voice. The whispers from other passengers. The humiliation that had been felt not just by the family, but by everyone watching. "I was wrong," Veronica admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The room was silent for a moment. Then, the HR manager nodded. "Yes," she said simply. "You were." Veronica's stomach churned. She had hoped, prayed, that acknowledging her mistake might soften the consequences. But she could see in their expressions that the decision had already been made. The gray-suited man closed the file in front of him. "Miss Summers, we cannot ignore the damage done, not only to the Caldwell family but to our airline's reputation. As of this moment, your employment with us is terminated. Effective immediately." The words hit her like a brick wall. She had known it was coming. But knowing didn't make it hurt any less. The HR manager continued. "You'll receive official documentation confirming the details of your dismissal. Security will escort you out of the building. We advise you not to discuss this with the press, as legal matters are still unfolding." Her hands shook as she reached for the paper they slid toward her, her fingers grazing the sharp edges of the document that held her fate in black and white ink. Her career, the thing she had spent years building, was gone. And the worst part? She had done this to herself. As she stood and followed the security guard down the hallway, she felt hollow. The polished floors beneath her feet felt unsteady. The fluorescent lights above her too bright, too exposing. She had spent her entire career believing she was right, believing she was fair, professional, just doing her job. But she had hurt someone. Not just Nathan Caldwell, not just Celeste, not just little Leo, whose only mistake had been existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had hurt herself, and now she had to live with that. For days after her termination, Veronica stayed in bed. She didn't check social media. She didn't turn on the news. She was too afraid to see what people were saying. But the world moved on without her. The Caldwells had become a symbol, not just of one family's dignity, but of every person who had ever been treated as if they didn't belong. Nathan's calm, unyielding response had gained him nationwide respect. Celebrities, journalists, and activists praised him for his grace under pressure. People called for change. And the airline? They had no choice but to deliver. Veronica, meanwhile, was lost. She replayed the moment over and over. Wondered how she had let herself become that person. Then, one night, she did something she never thought she would do. She opened her laptop, typed in the words, "unconscious bias," and started reading. She read about how it happens. How good people make bad choices based on beliefs they don't even realize they hold. She read stories, so many stories, of people just like Nathan and Celeste. People who had been judged before they even opened their mouths. And for the first time, she didn't justify herself. She didn't excuse what she had done. She faced it. Then, she wrote a letter. To Nathan, to Celeste. She didn't expect them to forgive her. She didn't deserve it, but she needed them to know that she understood now. That she would do better. Because if this experience had taught her anything, it was that being sorry wasn't enough. Change wasn't about feeling guilt. It was about doing something about it. And that's what she intended to do. Because the world didn't need another apology. It needed action. If you believe in change, if you believe in learning from mistakes, leave a comment below. Should Veronica be forgiven, or should she have faced even harsher consequences? Let's talk about it, because these conversations matter. And if you want to hear more stories that make us think, that make us feel, that push us to be better, like, share, and subscribe. Because this isn't just a story. It's a wake-up call. James never sought attention. He wasn't interested in making headlines, in becoming the face of some viral controversy. But when his family was humiliated, when his son had to witness a world where people like them could be dismissed and disregarded, James had no choice. And now, what started as a personal fight had become something bigger. The Anderson family's story exploded. News stations covered it. Social media flooded with support, outrage, personal stories from people who had faced the same bias, the same treatment, but had no power to fight back. The ripple effect had begun. A call for justice. James sat in his office, scrolling through emails. Every few seconds, a new one popped up. Mr. Anderson, I work for an airline in Europe. Your story has started discussions in our company. I just wanted to thank you for speaking up. We've been dealing with bias for years. And now people are finally listening. James, I just read about what happened to your family. I had a similar experience last year. But I was too scared to speak up. Seeing you hold them accountable makes me feel like maybe there's hope. Sir, I'm a flight attendant. I watched what happened, and I want you to know that not all of us are like that. Some of us care. Some of us fight from the inside. 2. Thank you for not letting this slide. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling. It wasn't just about them anymore. People were watching. People were waiting. Industry-wide change. What no one expected was how quickly the story spread beyond one airline. A senator tweeted about the incident, calling for a federal review of bias in customer service industries. A coalition of business leaders announced they would be re-examining hiring and training practices within their companies. Then, the other airlines started responding. Delta Airlines issued a statement. We recognize the need for stronger measures to prevent discrimination and are launching an independent review of our training protocols. United Airlines announced a new initiative to report racial bias incidents in real time, directly to their corporate offices. American Airlines pledged to create a customer advisory board, ensuring passengers from diverse backgrounds had a voice in company policy. One by one, industries took notice. Hotels, restaurants, retail giants. This wasn't just about one bad flight attendant anymore. It was about a system. And James? He had become the spark that lit the fire. Facing the critics. Of course, not everyone supported him. Some people dismissed it. It was just one mistake. Some people were angry. Why does everything have to be about race? Some people even blamed him. He's just doing this for attention. James read every single comment. And for every negative voice, there were 100 more saying, this isn't just about one family. It's about all of us. I've been there. We need change. That was the fuel he needed. The breaking point. A few weeks later, James received an unexpected phone call. It was from an Ivy League university. We're using your experience as a case study. The voice on the other end said, we're teaching future business leaders about corporate accountability, about how companies must take responsibility for bias within their ranks. James was stunned. Not because he didn't believe in the importance of what had happened, but because now, it was bigger than him. Bigger than his family. It was a lesson. It was a blueprint. A warning to companies everywhere. If you allow bias to go unchecked, you will be held accountable. A personal moment of victory. James wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for respect. One evening, he sat on the back porch with Celeste, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "We really did something, didn't we?" she murmured, leaning her head on his shoulder. James nodded, his voice quieter than usual. "Yeah, we did." A few feet away, their son, Leo, was playing with his toy airplane. He had no idea how much that small plane had come to symbolize. Celeste smiled, watching him. "Maybe one day, when he's older, we'll tell him everything, about how his parents fought for something bigger than themselves." James exhaled, a rare moment of peace settling over him. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe, by then, the world will already be better." The final impact. A year after the incident, James sat in a boardroom, not as a passenger, but as a guest speaker. Executives from multiple companies sat before him, listening, learning. "Let me be clear," James said, his voice strong, unwavering. "This was never about punishing one person. This was about fixing a culture that allowed discrimination to happen without consequences." He let that sink in. Customers deserve better. Employees deserve better. And if you're not willing to change, then the world is going to force you to. A silence settled over the room. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they can't hide anymore. And then, they clapped. Not out of obligation, but because they understood. Because they knew. James had changed everything. Your voice matters. This wasn't just about one flight. It wasn't just about one man. This was about all of us. Because when one person stands up, when one voice refuses to be silenced, the world has to listen. And now, the question is, what will you do? Comment below. Have you ever faced unfair treatment in a public space? How did you handle it? Like, share, and subscribe if you believe in standing up for what's right. Because change starts with us. The world had changed since that day on Flight 237. What started as a humiliating moment for James Anderson and his family had evolved into something much bigger. It was no longer just about one flight attendant's actions, nor just about one airline's policies. It was about something deeper, something systemic, a culture of bias that had been ignored for too long. James never expected to become a public figure, and certainly not in this way. But life had a way of placing people exactly where they needed to be. And when it did, the only question was, would you stand up? Or would you let injustice slide? James stood up, and now, the world was watching. 1 year later, the industry has changed. A year after the incident, James found himself walking into a packed conference hall. Executives from major airlines, hotel chains, and global corporations were gathered for an industry-wide forum on bias, fairness, and accountability. And James? He was the keynote speaker. As he stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the audience. These were the same types of people who had dismissed stories like his for decades. But now, they were listening, because they had no choice. James took a deep breath, scanning the room. Then, he spoke. 1 year ago today, my family boarded Flight 237 for what should have been an uneventful journey. We had our tickets. We were seated in first class. And yet, within minutes, we were treated as if we didn't belong. His voice remained calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. What happened to us that day wasn't just about a flight. It wasn't about one person making a mistake. It was about the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. He let the words sink in. We were judged, not by the contents of our character, not by our actions, but by assumptions. Assumptions rooted in bias. And when we pushed back, we were met with resistance. The room was silent, the tension thick. But here's the thing about resistance. When you know you're fighting for something bigger than yourself, you push harder. And that's exactly what we did. He looked at the executives seated in the front row. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded in understanding. In the aftermath, the conversation changed. Airlines, hotels, and businesses everywhere were forced to ask hard questions. Policies were rewritten. Training programs were launched. Accountability measures were strengthened. Then, his voice hardened. But policies mean nothing without action. He took a slow step forward. Real change only happens when leaders, People like you decide that accountability is more important than public relations. When you decide that fairness isn't a slogan, it's a practice. A few people clapped, more followed, and then, the entire room erupted in applause. James had shifted the narrative. The airline's transformation. After the fallout from Flight 237, the airline had been forced to act. Mandatory bias training was implemented for all employees. Customer feedback panels were created to ensure passenger concerns were addressed. A zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior was put in place, with real consequences. The CEO himself had reached out to James, acknowledging that without his persistence, these changes might never have happened. And it wasn't just one airline. Others followed suit, because one thing was now clear. The world was no longer willing to tolerate discrimination disguised as protocol. A personal victory for the Anderson family. For James, this fight wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that no other family, no other child, would ever have to endure what they went through. But the real victory came in the quiet moments. One evening, James sat in his backyard, watching the sunset. Celeste sat beside him, her fingers intertwined with his. In the distance, their son, Liam, played with a toy airplane. "Do you think you'll remember any of this?" Celeste asked softly, watching their son's laughter fill the air. James exhaled. "I don't know, maybe not the details, but I hope he remembers the lesson." Celeste tilted her head. "Which one?" "That when someone tries to push you down, you push back even harder. That when you see injustice, you don't look away, you stand up, you fight, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." Celeste smiled, squeezing his hand. "That's a good lesson." James watched Liam run across the grass, airplane in hand, and something inside him settled. This wasn't just about one moment. It was about creating a future where his son, and every child after him, never had to fight this battle. Because the best battles were the ones you never had to fight at all. Lessons to apply in life. The story of Flight 237 wasn't just about James and his family. It was about all of us. It was a wake-up call. Here's what we can all learn from it. 1. Speak up against injustice. Silence is compliance. If you see something wrong, say something. Whether it's in a workplace, a business, or a public space, your voice has power. 2. Never underestimate the impact of your actions. James didn't expect his story to change an industry. He just wanted fair treatment. But one voice can create a movement. Imagine what happens when we all stand together. 3. Hold people and companies accountable. Policies are meaningless without enforcement. If a company claims to value diversity, fairness, and respect, they must prove it through action, not words. 4. Challenge your own biases. Veronica, the flight attendant, thought she was just following protocol. But deep down, she was acting on assumptions. We must all ask ourselves, what biases do we hold? And how can we do better? 5. Kindness and fairness are not optional. Treating people with respect is the bare minimum. Whether you're a business owner, an employee, or just a bystander, remember, the way you treat others reflects who you truly are. A call to action. What will you do? This isn't just a story. It's a call to action. Have you ever faced discrimination or bias? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story matters. What would you have done in James's situation? Tell us your thoughts. Like this video if you believe in standing up for what's right. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful, real-life stories that challenge the world to be better. Because change starts with us. And together, we can build a world where everyone gets the respect they deserve. The fight isn't over. But with voices like yours, it's only just beginning. This conclusion ties everything together with emotion, resolution, and a call to action. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments.